Okay, so here's part 2 of our Build Your Own ATS series. And actually now in this part, we're actually getting to the point where we actually have a full workflow so we can actually see how things are going to flow end to end. And I really like starting with the user experience first, because then what we can actually start to do is figure out, okay, what do we actually need from a data perspective and a back-end perspective so that we are actually building something that is robust and actually meets all of our requirements. Because if you remember that we're essentially building the front end, then the back end, then the database, before we build the more complicated parts that are a little bit more fixed, we can actually play around with the front end and create something that looks ideal for our specific use case. And this is where if you're building it yourself, you can actually create something that is exactly how you want to use things. If you've been running an agency for a while, you probably have very specific ways that you want to do things. And that's really where the benefit of this comes in, versus if you were using a platform that was pre-built for you, you're actually restricted by the settings that are available and probably gated to some of the more advanced stuff based on the size of your agency and the contract that you have. So we're going to walk through what we've built out here. Again, this is a prototype, so we actually don't have this wired up to any data yet. This is just a browser-based interactive demo that we can actually walk through and figure out exactly how we're going to do things. If you've ever vibe coded anything before, this is probably where you're going to get to without actually building out the core infrastructure. But we actually do have this ready to deploy in Microsoft Azure. So once we're happy with this, we can actually make a live demo. I'm not going to bother with that right now because we actually really just want to play around and kind of refine things for what we need. So there's 2 prompts that I run in this session. The first one was actually to kick off the process. And so in the prompts, there's the Claude code, so the prototype kickoff. And this is something that I spec'd out in Claude Cowork based on the roadmap that we've created. And I essentially wanted to kick off that first prototype. You can find this in the GitHub folder that's going to be linked below. So no need to go into depth there. But what it essentially went through is a full workable workflow that we can then test to figure out, is this actually delivering what we need from a kind of content and data perspective? Is essentially, has it got everything that we need? So ignore the actual user interface right now. It looks pretty busy. We're actually going to refine that and perfect that a little bit later, but we want to make sure that we've got the data points correct first. So in going through this, what we actually created was something, and I've actually gone through a second prompt that we'll cover in just a second, but we've created this app, and it's under our prototype domain. So if you actually go to the main website, you won't be able to click through this. When you click through to prototype, we've created this thing called the desk. And this is the desk that you're going to work through as you're managing candidates going through a search process. And so we have the open roles here. Right now we have 1 open role, which is the financial controller. We have 2 roles that are not open. The finance business partner is closed and the management accountant is in draft. If we click through those, all the things that we went through to get a final candidate that was placed. If we look at the management accountant role, this may be something that we're scoping and maybe launching in the future. And it's telling us why it can't be launched yet. And so we need to add criterion that we're going to look through when we actually do the search. And so these are some items that I've put in place and actually created a more rigid structure such that we actually can't advance to the next stage of the search process until we've got all our things figured out. And this is kind of really creating a more robust, structured hiring process so that if I'm using it, then I'll probably follow this process anyway. But if we actually hand this over to someone else, if we hire a new recruiter or a coordinator or an assistant who's going to be helping us with this process, they actually can't manually move people through without the data and supporting evidence that we need, given that we're actually going to be passing these candidates to a hiring manager, and we're going to want to make sure that we have the quality there before we hand those over. And obviously this is all customizable, so you can refine this based on how you want, but we can look at one of the roles that's actively in search process right now, and this financial controller. And you can see what we actually did is with the in-brief that we did with Ellen on 2nd of March, we created these 5 criterias that we're actually going to be looking for to gather evidence as we're going through the process. And so you can see here the data that we're capturing on each of the candidates. We have the name, we have the current role and company, where the candidate is in the stages, and how we've moved them through. So when we gather evidence, we actually add that here so we know that we've actually captured that they are a qualified ACA or whatever. We've marked that we've contacted them, we've done a screening call, we've gathered evidence that they have a month end in a private equity backed business and managed a team of 3 or more. And now they're on this competency call where this may be something that a hiring manager is going to do. And we're going to kind of go deep in this one area. And so the next evidence that we're going to capture is this competency call. And the way that we're actually going to capture that is through a scorecard. And so we can look at the scorecard that we have. We already have all of the scorecard filled out. We actually didn't capture this in the carried forward. But when we go through the competency call, we actually don't have anything within the data that we have right now that is actually going to allow us to add something to capture that. So we're actually going to need to record it when we go through the competency call. And so we can actually start to think about this here. So we can kind of like look through the candidate's profile. We can, from the extraction that we have, you can see here that the CV parsing is not really doing a great job. And so that's something that we're going to want to look at some point in the future. But we can actually click something through here and say, okay, based on this, we actually have gathered evidence here. As we go back to the candidate, we can see that we're gathering more and more evidence. And so these boxes go to a filled status, showing that we've actually captured all the evidence that we need. Once we've completed the competency call, we can advance them to submitted, and we're going to send the competency call message. And so what that does is it sends a message to the candidate saying, this is what we're going to do on the competency call, and you can customize this, but you can think how this may integrate with a CRM or just with your Gmail inbox, so that as you're moving candidates through the process, you have this MCP that's actually then going to send that message out. You can proofread it and send it out, and then you know that you're staying on top of your candidate communication as you're going through the process. If we want to reject someone, and I click this button here, we actually find that we can't reject anyone without a reason code or with data in here. And this is really helpful because if we're building our own ATS and we're going to be wanting to look back at all of our candidates in the future, or maybe repurpose candidates from one search into another search after they were rejected, we actually want the data on them to try and figure out why they weren't a good fit. And so something like, they withdrew from the process is a good signal that maybe that wasn't the right fit for them. And we expand on that with the data here so that in a future state, we have our candidate database that we can go back through and source from that first, because we already have warm relationships. If we go back to the financial controller and actually take a look at someone who is in an early stage of the process where they've been sourced, we can see how we would actually look at this as we're going through the process end to end. And sourcing is essentially just taking a potential candidate, dropping them into the platform. And so this may be something that you have outsourced, or maybe you even have an AI tool that's going to do this for you. Drop them and push them into your database. And then we're actually going to look at the scorecard for sourced and then record a finding that we have found that they have this experience. And that's the kind of go, no go from stage to stage. We want to be looking at the record for this individual and being able to add more and more data. So when we get a LinkedIn profile, if we get a GitHub repo, or if we get a podcast that they've been on or an article they've written, we should be able to add all of that in here and actually build a bigger picture of that individual's capability. All we're looking at now is, can we actually manage candidates through the process? And is this going to give us enough information in order to do that? So that was the first prompt that we actually went through, just actually getting this prototype up and running so that in theory, we could actually manage a search and actually move candidates through and send them to our hiring manager for their screening. So we're actually presenting them as a likely candidate for hiring. Once I actually went through that, I was looking through the process and I felt that it didn't actually quite match up with the structured hiring process that I really like to implement. It's actually based on everything that I learned building these out in Greenhouse when I used to work at Wayfair. And we look at all global recruiting patterns and try and figure out which is the most optimal. And there's actually pretty consistently a structured flow that we should follow, where you start with top of funnel and you actually get kind of a little bit of information, knockout questions at the top of funnel. At each stage, you can spend a little bit more time with that candidate and go into a little bit more detail to the point where you get to the end of the process. You should know everything you need to know about the candidate in order to make a clear yes or no decision. And I actually drafted a video of this. This was back in September 2024, so almost 2 years ago. But the process hasn't changed. It's still this 5-step process. And what I actually did is, instead of revisiting this, watching it and trying to figure out what I said at the time, I just copied the transcript from in here and then dropped it into a text file in my repo. And what this allowed me to do is, instead of repurposing old content, I actually just created once I'd actually synced everything back, just sent another prompt to our code agent that said, okay, this looks fine for now, but I've created a transcript of the structured hiring process that I like to follow, updated in here, update the workflow, naming, user experience, basically everything that I said here. Can you actually put this into the app for me? And you could do this, you could actually copy from one of my videos, you could go somewhere else that you like, maybe see something that looks really cool that someone has done with AI, just copy the transcript, drop it in here and say, hey, follow the process that this person has followed and create this within my custom app. So now what we have is a whole bunch of things in the middle part of the workflow where we actually have the process outlined: sourced, contacted, screening, competency, submitted. And this was not in that original prototype that we built out. And we can actually see how our funnel's working. So we have 10 people sourced, 7 are contacted, 6 screened, 3 competency, 1 submitted, and the client interview is 0 so far. So very quickly we can see how is our funnel looking, and we can actually then start to think about, in the future, do we add predicted number of sourced candidates that we need in order to generate one hire at the bottom of the funnel? Do we actually look at the source channels to figure out where we should actually go searching? And then can we actually learn from source channels of previous searches to figure out where the best source for a future candidate is going to come from? So all these data points are helpful now as we're building this kind of use case of one candidate flow. As we start to think about what happens when we do 10 or 30 or 100 different searches, do we actually have the data in order to train future models and give us better decisions as we're kind of building out this applicant tracking system? What we also have done is actually outline the candidate workflow a little bit better. And so what we've tried not to do is do any kind of stack ranking. All we're doing is saying, do we have evidence that the candidate has the experience that we outlined as important in the brief? And if they do, they get 5 filled in boxes. And as you're going through the search process, you should start to see that when someone's getting to the end of it, all of those boxes should be filled out. When they're at the very beginning, we should have none of them filled out because we actually haven't looked through their application or their profile to figure out if this source candidate actually has everything that we need. The other thing that we've added here, and this is something that I think I'm going to push back on, or at least give us a little bit more flexibility, is this auto closure bucket. One of the things that this does is prevents us from creating a really bad candidate experience where we leave candidates in a pipeline for months on end, never get back to them, never reach out. So this candidate's going to get closed in 3 days. And if I click through, what we can see is that we actually don't have a way to edit this right now. And so I think that's something that we're going to want to change in terms of the actual way we integrate with the data and how we might want to kind of create a little bit more customization into our workflow. We can actually go through this line by line and just really understand what it's doing, what it's building, so that I'm not surprised if something gets taken out or something gets added that I didn't ask for. I think we're still a long way away from a completed product, but what we at least have is a working platform that we could drop a candidate into in theory and actually capture evidence of their candidacy, and at the other side push them out to a candidate, whether that is just copying and pasting and sending an email, or some kind of API into an applicant tracking system, or maybe something built in to our Gmail instance so that we actually create this custom candidate profile with all of the evidence tracked against all of the briefs that they have shared, our own summary of why we think this is a good candidate for them, and then maybe linking to a scheduling tool so that instead of back and forth, we can actually just schedule the interview directly over email. So there's all these opportunities to improve the operational flow so that we can actually get a very streamlined process and move these candidates through as quickly as possible, creating a good candidate experience, improving the quality of the candidates that they're going to see at the end because fewer people withdraw, and ultimately closing this role as soon as we get a really strong candidate. So that's it for this session. I think next time we'll go into a little bit more depth on the kind of step-by-step workflow. I think I'm going to change a lot of this and remove a lot of the wordiness and actually create more kind of icons and maybe more kind of intuitive drag and drop options. But we'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to part 3 and go through that with you.